After the hearing and the department's decision, things began to settle down. Officer Langley's dismissal was a significant step forward, but for James, it wasn't the end of the journey. He knew that real change would take time. It was one step, but it wasn't enough on its own. What mattered now was how the community and the police department would move forward. James reflected on the entire experience. The situation had started as a routine traffic stop, something he never expected to turn into a public issue. Yet it had become more than that. It had become a conversation about justice, accountability, and the way law enforcement and the community interacted. Throughout the process, James had kept his composure. He had remained calm, even when things felt uncertain, and had been determined to find a way to ensure the situation was handled fairly. He knew that in moments like these, how a person responded mattered just as much as the actions themselves. In the days following the hearing, James continued to work with local organizations to help bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement. He spoke at meetings, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak up when something wasn't right. He wasn't just advocating for police reform. He was advocating for mutual understanding and respect between people from all walks of life. One afternoon, James received a letter from the police chief. It was a thank you letter, acknowledging his patience and his role in helping push the department toward change. The letter also outlined the new training programs the department had introduced to address bias and improve officer interactions with civilians. James was proud of the progress, but he knew it was just the start. He spent more time in the community, meeting with local leaders, attending events, and continuing to speak about the importance of fairness and accountability. The conversations were often difficult, but they were necessary. He believed that these talks would help move the needle toward better understanding. Over time, James noticed something changing. The atmosphere between the police and the community began to shift. People were more willing to speak openly about their concerns, and officers were more willing to listen. There was still work to be done, but it was clear that the dialogue had started, and that was a huge step forward. Months later, James attended another youth event, one where he had been invited as a guest speaker. This time, he spoke not just about leadership, but about how one person's actions could spark change. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, James said to the crowd. You have the power to make a difference. Sometimes change starts with just one person, but it takes all of us to make it last. The room was silent as the young people listened to his words. James felt a sense of pride, knowing that his story could inspire the next generation to stand up for what was right. As he left the event that day, he knew that while there was still much to be done, the future was brighter than it had been before. He had played a part in something important, something that could leave a lasting legacy, not just for him, but for the community, the police force, and the generations to come. The tension continued to build as Officer Maria Sanchez took a few steps closer to the situation. She observed the way Officer Derek Langley stood rigidly, eyes fixed on Rear Admiral James H. Kane, and the way James remained calm, not showing any signs of aggression. Maria had been on the force for years, and her instincts told her something didn't quite add up. Suspicious, Maria repeated, glancing at Langley, who seemed unbothered by her questioning. She could sense his frustration with the situation, but there was something more. What exactly is making you suspicious of him? Langley shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't expecting this level of questioning, especially from a fellow officer. He's just not cooperating, he said, his voice uncertain. And we got no idea who he is or why he's here. Maria raised an eyebrow. No idea. This man just told you he's a guest speaker for a youth event. That's not suspicious. It sounds perfectly normal. James watched the exchange between the two officers, feeling a slight sense of relief at Maria's voice of reason. He'd been trying to keep his composure, hoping the situation would resolve itself without more trouble. He's lying. I've got a gut feeling about this guy, Langley insisted, his tone turning defensive. James felt the frustration rise inside him, but refused to let it show. He had spent years in the military under much more intense pressure. He knew how to handle difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a misunderstanding based on something he couldn't control. "I can assure you, officer, that I am who I say I am," James said, his voice steady but firm. "If you'd like, I can provide further verification. I don't mind." Langley didn't seem to hear him. Instead, his eyes flickered nervously around, his grip on his firearm tightening. Maria noticed this change in behavior immediately. "Langley, step back," she said, her voice more authoritative now. "You're escalating this unnecessarily." Langley hesitated but slowly moved away from James, clearly annoyed but unwilling to challenge Maria in front of the growing crowd. His hands remained at his sides, but James noticed his fingers twitching nervously, as though ready to act. Meanwhile, the small crowd of onlookers grew larger, with some people taking out their phones to record the scene. James realized that this was no longer just a traffic stop. It was becoming a spectacle. Some people were murmuring quietly, while others shot curious glances at the officers. James held his ground, hoping that with Maria's intervention, things might calm down. His heart rate remained steady, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things could take a wrong turn any minute. Maria took a deep breath and spoke again, this time with authority. "I suggest we all take a moment to de-escalate this and figure out what's really going on. Derek, I'm going to call for backup. You stay here and calm down." Langley looked like he was about to protest, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. James, for his part, remained still, his posture calm and controlled, waiting for the situation to resolve. He hoped that Maria's actions would bring some clarity to the growing confusion. The tension in the air grew thicker as the officer stood by Rear Admiral James H. Kane's car. James remained composed, his hands resting visibly on the steering wheel, as years of military discipline taught him to remain calm under pressure. The officer glanced again at James' license, then returned his sharp gaze. "Step out of the car," the officer said. His tone wasn't a request. It was a command. James hesitated for a brief moment, not out of defiance, but out of confusion. He had done nothing wrong. "May I ask why, officer?" he inquired politely. The officer's expression hardened. "Step out of the car." Now, understanding the importance of cooperation, James complied. He slowly opened the door and got out, careful to keep his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Standing outside his car, James noticed how the officer looked him up and down, as if searching for something to confirm his suspicion. "Turn around," the officer instructed, motioning for James to face away from him. James' heart rate remained steady, though he could feel the weight of the moment. He turned as instructed, silently hoping the situation would soon be resolved. "What are you really doing here?" the officer asked again, his voice laced with doubt. James repeated his explanation calmly. "As I said earlier, officer, I'm heading to the community center for a youth program. I'm a guest speaker." But the officer didn't seem to believe him. "You have any proof of that?" James thought for a moment. His phone was in his car, where he had saved the event details. "If you'll allow me to retrieve my phone from the car, I can show you the invitation," he offered. The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as though weighing James' words. A few passers-by began to gather at a distance, their curiosity drawn by the sight of a man being questioned so thoroughly. Some had their phones out, quietly recording the interaction. The officer took a step closer. "I don't need you to grab anything. Just answer my questions," he said, his tone firm. James nodded, deciding not to press the matter further. "Of course, officer, I'm happy to cooperate." As the minutes dragged on, it became increasingly clear to James that this wasn't a routine stop. The officer's questions seemed less about traffic and more about his presence in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, another police car arrived, and a second officer, a woman named Maria Sanchez, stepped out. She glanced at James, then at her colleague, noticing the unusual tension in the scene. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. The first officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward James. "He's acting suspicious," he said flatly. Maria looked at James, then back at the first officer. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. "Suspicious?" she asked. "What's he done?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. The situation was starting to settle, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He had experienced a lot in his military career: missions, challenges, and pressure. But this moment felt different. It was an unexpected turn of events, one that left him with more questions than answers. How had this misunderstanding happened in the first place? As the older officer finished his conversation with Officer Langley, he gave James one final apology. "Again, I'm sorry, sir. This won't happen again." James nodded but didn't feel the need to respond. His mind was already turning over what had just happened. Later that day, Maria Sanchez reached out to James. "I wanted to check in, sir. Are you all right?" James appreciated her concern and took a deep breath before answering. "I'm fine, but I don't want this to go unnoticed. This kind of situation could have ended very badly, and we can't ignore that. It's not just about me. It's about how others might be treated in the future." Maria agreed. "I completely understand, sir. I'm going to make sure this gets looked into. This kind of behavior, whether intentional or not, needs to be addressed." Over the next few days, an internal investigation was launched within the police department. The body cameras worn by both officers provided crucial evidence. Officer Langley's actions were under scrutiny, and his record was reviewed for any past complaints or patterns of behavior that could explain his actions. Meanwhile, Maria Sanchez began to gather statements from the bystanders who had witnessed the traffic stop. Some had already sent in videos they had recorded on their phones, and others came forward to give their accounts of the interaction. James, as a witness, provided a clear and calm statement as well, explaining how everything unfolded from his perspective. The department took the matter seriously. A few days after the incident, Maria met with James again to give him an update. "I've got some news. Officer Langley has a history of incidents like this. Small things, but it's clear there's been some underlying behavior that hasn't been addressed until now. The department is taking action." James listened carefully, trying not to show too much emotion. He knew how important it was that these matters were dealt with swiftly and fairly. "What's going to happen to him?" he asked, his voice steady. "He'll be suspended while they complete the investigation. If things go the way I think they will, he'll face further consequences." Maria's voice was firm, but James could hear the weight of the situation in her words. James nodded, knowing that the investigation would likely be difficult for everyone involved, but also understanding that it was necessary. No one should ever have to go through what he had experienced, and if this investigation could prevent something similar from happening again, it would be worth it. In the days that followed, more news about the investigation spread. The department began to receive feedback from the public, and many people expressed support for James' call for accountability. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about making sure that such incidents didn't happen to anyone else. The tension in the air didn't ease as quickly as James had hoped. Officer Maria Sanchez stepped back and began to speak into her radio, calling for backup, but her eyes never left Officer Derek Langley. James could feel the heat of the moment, but he knew it wasn't over yet. He kept his body language calm, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate any further. A few seconds later, another police car pulled up. The officer who stepped out was much older than the others, a man with salt and pepper hair and a calm but serious demeanor. He looked at the scene before him and then at James, taking in the situation. His eyes then moved to Langley, who was still visibly uncomfortable. "Everything okay here?" the older officer asked, his voice steady but questioning. Langley glanced at his superior, and for a brief moment, James saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "This guy, he's acting strange," Langley muttered, clearly still convinced that James wasn't who he claimed to be. The older officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't rush to judgment. Instead, he turned toward James, his expression softening. "Sir, I apologize for the trouble. I've been with the department a long time, and we try to make sure everything runs smoothly. Let me see your ID again." James nodded and reached into his pocket to retrieve his identification. He handed it over with a steady hand. As the older officer took a look at the ID, a slight recognition flickered in his eyes. He looked at James once more, his expression changing. "Rear Admiral James H. Kane," the officer asked in a more respectful tone. James nodded, his heart rate steady, though he was finally feeling a sense of relief. "That's right. I'm here for a charity event for local youth. I'm a guest speaker." The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. He nodded slowly, clearly understanding the mistake. "I see. My apologies again, sir. There's no need for further questioning." But before the situation could fully calm down, Langley spoke again. "But he's... Langley struggled to explain himself, his words faltering. He seemed unwilling to accept that he had made a mistake, and his discomfort was obvious. Maria Sanchez, who had been listening quietly, cut in. "Officer Langley, this isn't helping. We've got the situation under control now. You need to take a step back." Langley's face flushed with frustration, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked away, his jaw clenched tightly. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but he had been wrong. The older officer, seeing the tension between his colleagues, turned back to James. "I'm sorry for the trouble, sir. It's a rare situation for us, and it won't happen again. We appreciate your patience." James gave a small nod, trying to remain understanding. "I understand. I know you're doing your job, but mistakes like this should be prevented. It's important to get to the truth quickly." As the officers exchanged a few more words, James stood by, quietly reflecting on the past few minutes. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but some people remained, still watching the scene unfold. James hoped that this misunderstanding would not be remembered for too long, but more than that, he hoped it would open the door to better understanding and respect. Rear Admiral James H. Kane was a man of dignity and calmness. He had spent over 30 years serving his country, leading missions that saved countless lives. Now retired from active duty, James enjoyed giving back to the community. On this sunny afternoon, he was on his way to a charity event to speak with young people about the importance of leadership and kindness. James drove his old, reliable sit-in, wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans. He didn't think twice about his casual outfit. It was comfortable, and he wanted to connect with the youth he was about to meet. The event was being held in a suburban neighborhood he hadn't visited before. As James drove through the quiet streets, he noticed a police car behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe they're just passing through, he thought. But as he turned left, the police car turned too. When he switched lanes, so did the officer. James glanced in his rearview mirror. The patrol car's presence started to feel intentional. Still, he stayed calm. He had done nothing wrong. His driving was steady, and he always followed the rules of the road. Suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights came on. The siren blared for a moment, signaling James to pull over. Surprised, James slowed down and parked his car on the side of the road. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay polite and cooperative. The officer, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward James' window. James rolled it down and greeted him politely. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer's tone was sharp as he replied, "License and registration." He didn't offer any explanation for the stop, which struck James as unusual. Still, James kept his voice steady as he handed over his documents. The officer studied James' license, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. Then he looked at James. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked, his tone more suspicious than curious. James explained calmly, "I'm headed to a charity event. I'm a guest speaker for the youth program at the community center." The officer didn't seem convinced. "This neighborhood doesn't see many strangers," he said, leaning closer to inspect James' car. James felt the atmosphere shift. The situation, which had started as a simple traffic stop, now felt heavier. He noticed a few people on the sidewalk glancing over. Their curiosity piqued. James kept his hands on the steering wheel, fully aware of how easily things could escalate. As the officer stepped back, James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't about a traffic violation. He remained calm, but his instincts told him that this moment would soon turn into something much bigger. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Officer Langley's actions continued. James, though relieved that some justice had been served, knew the process wasn't over yet. There were still important questions to answer, especially about the systemic issues within the police department. He wanted to ensure that this situation wasn't just an isolated incident, but a step toward lasting change. Maria Sanchez, the officer who had stood up for him during the traffic stop, kept in touch with James. She shared regular updates on the progress of the investigation. "The department is taking this seriously," she told him one afternoon. "They've started reviewing their training materials and are considering new programs for recognizing and addressing biases." James appreciated Maria's efforts. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, but hearing that the department was committed to improvement gave him hope. "I'm glad to hear that," James replied. "It's important that we not only address mistakes, but also prevent them from happening in the future." Maria agreed. "That's exactly what they're working toward. It won't be easy, but it's a start." As the investigation unfolded, the department also reached out to community leaders, activists, and other officers for their input. They wanted to ensure that they were listening to everyone involved and gaining a full understanding of the concerns people had. It wasn't just about one officer's actions anymore. It was about building trust between the community and law enforcement. James found himself invited to meetings and discussions on police reform. He wasn't used to being at the center of such conversations, but he believed in the importance of these talks. He shared his thoughts, emphasizing the need for transparency, fairness, and continued self-reflection. "We can't just assume that things are working perfectly," he said during one of the meetings. "We have to keep looking for ways to improve." During these meetings, James met many passionate people who cared deeply about the future of their communities. Some were young, others were more experienced, but all of them wanted to see change. James was impressed by their energy and their willingness to speak out. He realized that while his situation had been difficult, it was also a chance to bring people together. After weeks of interviews, meetings, and conversations, the department released a report on the investigation. It acknowledged that Officer Langley had violated department policies and recommended further action. Langley had been dismissed from the police force, and the department announced plans to implement new policies aimed at reducing racial bias. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some people were satisfied with the result, believing it showed that the department was serious about accountability. Others felt that it didn't go far enough, arguing that more needed to be done. James understood both sides of the argument, but he was encouraged that the conversation was happening. For the first time in a long time, he felt that real change might be possible. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew that people were starting to listen. As the investigation into Officer Langley's actions continued, the pressure began to mount on the police department. James had done his part, staying calm, providing clear statements, and encouraging the process to unfold fairly. He wasn't looking for revenge, but he did want justice. He believed that if this situation was handled correctly, it could set an example for others, showing that no one, no matter their rank or profession, was above accountability. Days turned into weeks, and finally, the police department announced the results of the investigation. Officer Langley had been found guilty of misconduct. The evidence was clear. His actions had been unjustified, and his treatment of James had been based on assumptions, not facts. He had ignored the professionalism that the job required and, in doing so, put both himself and James in a difficult situation. Langley was officially suspended from duty, and the department moved forward with disciplinary measures. The media coverage of the investigation was extensive, and many people were talking about it. The story wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It had become a conversation about systemic change, about how officers were trained and how their biases could influence their decisions. For James, the investigation's outcome was a relief, but it didn't bring back the unsettling feeling he had experienced. The situation had been stressful, and he couldn't forget how close things had come to going terribly wrong. However, he was proud of how the process had been handled. It wasn't easy, but it was right. A week later, James was invited to speak at a public event about the importance of fairness, justice, and holding everyone accountable. He stood in front of a crowd of people, many of them young, eager to learn about leadership, and reflected on everything that had happened. He spoke about his experience with the traffic stop and the lessons he had learned. But most importantly, he emphasized the need for understanding. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice steady and confident. "But when we make them, we need to own up to them and do everything we can to make things right." James' speech was met with applause. He could see that the people in the crowd were taking his words to heart. They understood that what mattered most wasn't the mistake itself, but how you chose to respond to it. A few days later, James received a letter from the police department. It was an official apology, not just from the officers involved, but from the chief of police himself. The letter acknowledged the error, praised James for his patience, and thanked him for helping make the process transparent. It also stated that they were committed to improving their training programs to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. While James appreciated the gesture, he knew that real change would take time. But this was a step in the right direction. The road to better understanding between law enforcement and the community wouldn't be easy, but he believed that by speaking out, by holding people accountable, and by showing kindness and understanding, things could improve. The day James had been waiting for finally arrived. After weeks of investigation and deliberation, Officer Langley's disciplinary hearing was scheduled. James had stayed involved throughout the entire process, and now it was time for the final decisions to be made. James stood in front of the police department building, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. He knew that this was a pivotal moment, not just for Langley, but for the entire police force. It was a chance to set a standard, to show that accountability and fairness mattered. It wasn't about punishing one officer. It was about ensuring that justice was done, and that the same mistakes wouldn't happen again. When the hearing began, James sat in a quiet room with a few others who had been invited to observe. The department's leaders, the legal team, and some community representatives were all present. Langley, looking uneasy, was seated across from them. His posture was tense, and it was clear that he didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. The hearing was straightforward. The department reviewed the findings of the investigation, going over the evidence and the statements that had been made. Officer Langley's previous record came under scrutiny, and it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. There were other moments where Langley had shown poor judgment, but this particular stop with James had highlighted the severity of his behavior. When it was time for James to speak, he stood with calm confidence. He didn't want revenge, and he wasn't looking to make Langley suffer. He just wanted to ensure that this was an opportunity for growth, for the entire department to reflect on how they could improve. "I believe in fairness," James began, his voice steady. "I believe that mistakes can be corrected, but we also need to make sure that they don't happen again. This incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. We must be accountable for our actions." James paused for a moment, looking around the room. "I'm not here to see someone punished for the sake of it. I'm here to make sure that our system is better because of this. We all make mistakes, but we need to learn from them. I hope this serves as an example for everyone." His words were powerful, and everyone in the room seemed to take them to heart. Langley, however, said little. He remained quiet, but his eyes were lowered, his guilt clear. After the hearing, the decision was made. Officer Langley was officially dismissed from the force. He had violated the department's policies, and his actions had shown a lack of judgment that couldn't be ignored. For James, the decision was a step in the right direction. However, it wasn't just about Langley. The police department also promised to implement new programs to address racial biases in their officers. They would provide more training, especially on how to interact with people from all walks of life. The department also promised to work more closely with the community, building stronger, more trusting relationships. For James, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger. The change he hoped for was finally starting to happen.